Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all tonight to this lecture. It's the third in a series that's been organised by the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. The lecture series is titled Why Study the History of Trotskyism? My name is Patrick O'Connor. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party's National Committee, and I'll be chairing the meeting tonight. In this series, we began a couple of weeks ago now on the subject of October 1917, the opening shot of the World Revolution. Last week, the lecture discussed the question of the left opposition's struggle against Stalinism, and tonight we're dealing with the critical political issues bound up with the founding of the Fourth International in 1938. I'd like to now introduce our meeting participants. Max Boddy is our main speaker tonight. He's 31 years old. He's a member of the SEP's National Committee, and he's also Secretary of the party's Newcastle branch. Max has completed previously a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Newcastle, majoring in Aboriginal Studies, and he now works in the community sector. He's a regular writer for the World Socialist website on issues confronting asylum seekers and their brutal and illegal treatment at the hands of successive Australian governments, Liberal and Labor. After Max's lecture, we're again pleased to have on our panel Nick Beams. Nick, I'm sure, is very familiar to many of us. He's the former National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, a member of the World Socialist website, International Editorial Board, and he's a leading authority on Marx's political economy and history. Nick delivered the first lecture in this series on the Russian Revolution, and then also joined us last week for the second lecture on the left opposition that was delivered by the SEP's Assistant National Secretary, Cheryl Crucifer. Anybody joining us tonight who hasn't viewed or participated in those events, you can review the recording either via the SEP Australia Facebook page or via YouTube. I believe that links are being posted in the chat box as I speak. So you can click on those after the event and view the previous lectures if you haven't already. But without any further ado, I'd like to pass things over to Max Boddy. Good evening, Max.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you. I'd also like to send my greetings to everyone participating, obviously in Australia and around the world. On September 3rd, 1938, a delegation of revolutionaries met in a farmhouse belonging to veteran French revolutionist Alfred Rosemer in Périgny, a suburb on the outskirts of Paris. 21 delegates were present, representing organisations from 11 different countries, including France, Great Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, Italy, Brazil, Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, and the United States. They were meeting under conditions of near illegality, being relentlessly pursued by the French bourgeois government, fascist organisations, and the counter-revolutionary Stalinists. For security reasons, the meeting only had one day of official proceedings, and communiques were published prior to the Congress saying it was being held in Lausanne in Switzerland. This was the founding Congress of the Fourth International, the party of World Socialist Revolution. In tonight's lecture, we will be answering the question, why was this meeting an event of world historic significance? An empirical observer may point to the numerically larger political parties of social democracy or the communist parties internationally. But such a vulgar view of history misses the crucial question of what role these parties played in suppressing the class struggle, which revealed the need for a new revolutionary party to be established. Stalin recognised the significance of the founding of the party and was deeply fearful of Leon Trotsky and his supporters. Having once been a member of a revolutionary party, he knew that you could be in jail 1 month and 11 months later be the head of a workers' state. The greatest threat to his survival and the survival of the bureaucracy he represented was the Fourth International. Stalin would receive personal reports on the work of the GPU agents in finding and assassinating leading figures of the movement. Prior to the founding Congress, 4 leading figures of the Fourth International were murdered, including Trotsky's son, Leon Zadov, the third of his children to be killed by Stalin's henchmen. The culmination of this campaign was to be the assassination of Leon Trotsky on the 21st of August 1940, whose 80th anniversary we will be commemorating this year. Despite these immense personal and political pressures, Trotsky and his supporters fought to establish the Fourth International. They understood it was of historic necessity, recognising that a vanguard party was the decisive question in determining the outcome of the revolutionary struggles of the masses. The delegates who met on September 3rd, 1938, approved a series of resolutions and voted on the adoption of the founding program of the Fourth International. Penned by Trotsky, who was not able to be present at the founding Congress as he was in exile in Coyoacan, Mexico, the full title of the document is, quote, "The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International, the mobilization of the masses around transitional demands to prepare the conquest of power, the transitional program," end quote. Drawing on the totality of the experiences of the working class in the epoch of imperialism, above all, the summation of the experiences of the left opposition, Trotsky wrote in the opening sentence of the transitional program, quote, "The world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat," end quote. Trotsky explained that the objective prerequisites for a workers' revolution had not only ripened, but had become somewhat rotten. All of mankind's productive forces had begun to stagnate, and new inventions and ideas failed to raise the material wealth of society. The underlying contradictions which produced the First World War had not been resolved by its conclusion, and the resulting financial crisis of 1929, known as the Great Depression, imposed ever greater suffering on the masses worldwide. Major imperialist powers, seeing no way out of the crisis, began to view armed conflict as the only solution. International relations had deteriorated and reached an impasse. Just 20 years after the conclusion of the First World War, the Second was on the horizon and rapidly approaching. These conditions created a vast social crisis in every country. In the years leading up to the founding Congress, revolutionary struggles had erupted, with the masses entering on the road of revolution. But at each turn, they had been blocked by their own leaderships. The formulation of the crisis of revolutionary leadership crystallized the lessons of these experiences in a concise and concrete form. Drawing on these lessons, above all the transformation of the Third International under the Stalinist bureaucracy into an agency of imperialism, it defined the problem of the epoch. In order for this crisis of leadership to be overcome, the Fourth International, as the instrument of world socialist revolution, had to be built. And Trotsky often said that it's not the party that makes the program, it is the program that makes the party. The development of such a program consists in first telling the truth. That is, it must have a scientifically grounded appraisal of the objective situation. While the most advanced workers will recognise the correctness of this appraisal, not all workers will immediately accept this program. This is because the consciousness of the working class lags behind the objective situation. Therefore, the task of the party consists in bridging this gap in consciousness. And this is what underlines the conception of transitional demands. As Trotsky wrote in the founding document, quote, "It is necessary to help the masses in the process of the daily struggle to find the bridge between present demand and the socialist program of the revolution. This bridge should include a system of transitional demands stemming from today's conditions and from today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class, and unalterably leading to one final conclusion, the conquest of power by the proletariat," end quote. Now, the question of transitional demands assumes greater contemporary significance in the period we are living through today. The crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed capitalism in its death agony. The bourgeoisie are incapable of dealing with this disaster and toboggans the world towards destitution and death. This directly poses before the masses the necessity of overthrowing capitalism. However, the working class as a whole does not immediately draw these far-reaching conclusions. It is necessary to link the current consciousness of workers to their historic tasks. Now, what workers do immediately recognise in this pandemic is the need to protect their work and, above all, their lives. This is why our party has raised a series of transitional demands to link the crisis to the question of taking power. We have called for the creation of rank-and-file health and safety committees whose fundamental demand is that life should be placed before profit. Now, for this perspective to be realised, the working class will come up against the entire capitalist framework. It will reveal that the only way to resolve this question is for the working class to take power. The instrument to complete this task is the Fourth International. In returning to the transitional program, a crucial aspect of the document is the way it deals with the numerous skeptics who argued it was too early to build a new international. They claimed such a party could only be built on the basis of great events. Well, in response, Trotsky wrote, the Fourth International has already arisen out of great events, the greatest defeats of the proletariat in history. The cause of these defeats is to be found in the degeneration and perfidy of the old leadership. The class struggle does not tolerate an interruption. The Third International, following the Second, is dead for the purposes of revolution. Long live the Fourth International, end quote. To gain a deeper understanding of the significance of these words and the founding of this party, we will review some of the lessons of these great events. While the founding Congress occurred in 1938, the calling for a new international took place 5 years earlier. On January 30th, 1933, in a backroom conspiracy orchestrated by the German bourgeoisie, German President Paul von Hindenburg installed Adolf Hitler, the leader of the fascist Nazi Party, as German Chancellor. The crisis of world imperialism and the resulting world economic crisis had a profound impact of the working and middle classes of Germany. German society was deeply divided. Democracy existed in name only, and the government existed through a series of emergency decrees. The First World War had resolved none of the underlying contradictions that gave rise to it. German business desperately saw the need to unleash another war of aggression across Europe to resolve its economic decline. Just as with the War of 1914, the German ruling elite sought to dramatically reorganise Europe for its own productive needs. Now, to do this, the German ruling elite knew they had to deal with their greatest enemy at home, the working class and their labour organisations. Unable to do so through parliamentary means, they turned to Hitler and his fascist forces, whom they were financing. Now, at the time, the Nazi Party were able to turn the despair and ruin of the middle classes and the rage of the lumpen elements into a battering ram against workers' organisations. Hitler's coming to power was not inevitable, nor is the claim by some that the majority of Germans supported Hitler. In the last lecture, presented by Comrade Sherrill, we went through some of the complex questions involved in the defeat of the working class in Germany. In essence, the Comintern refused to wage a fight against fascism, instigating instead an ultra-left turn labelling social democracy as social fascists. This split the working class and allowed Hitler to come to power without a shot being fired. This was the greatest defeat of the working class in history. The Nazis then obliterated the workers' organisations and placed its leaders and members in concentration camps. In response, the Comintern released a statement reiterating the correctness of its ultra-leftist line and banned all discussion about it. Under the new slogan, "After Hitler Us," the bureaucracy essentially abandoned the role of developing the consciousness of the working class to the fascists. Not one Communist Party internationally opposed this decision. Trotsky drew far-reaching conclusions from this defeat. He recognised that this meant the Third International was no longer a Bolshevik party. As he wrote in July 1933, quote, "An organisation which was not roused by the thunder of fascism and which submits docilely to such outrageous acts of bureaucracy demonstrates thereby that it is dead and that nothing can ever revive it," end quote. The Third International, Trotsky concluded, had transformed into an open agent of imperialism, and the working class now needed a new party, a new international. Over the next 5-year period, from 1933 to 1938, between the call for the Fourth International and its founding Congress, Trotsky waged an implacable fight for its founding. And this period features some of Trotsky's sharpest and most insightful writings. A pivotal experience of this period was Trotsky's struggle against a wide range of centrist organisations, which in this period had influence within the working class across Europe. Their growth had its roots in the crisis of capitalism at the time. The Second International, which opposed revolution and claimed conditions could be improved through reform, were rendered useless. On the other hand, the policies of the Comintern opposed and actively suppressed any revolutionary organisation of the working class. In defining centrism, Trotsky wrote in a 1934 article entitled "Centrism and the Fourth International" the following, quote, "In the sphere of ideology, centrism leads a parasitic existence," end quote. He explained that while centrist groups will express the need for revolution, they attempt to steer a middle course between revolutionary Marxism on one side and Stalinism and social democracy on the other. While a number of centrist organisations claim they supported a new international, they wanted to retain their freedom to manoeuvre in their own national sphere. That type of opportunist politics had led to the great betrayal of the Second International when its member sections, in defiance of international resolutions, voted to support their own government in the First World War. Delivering his assessment of the London Bureau, one such centrist tendency in Britain, Trotsky wrote, quote, "It is possible for a national group to maintain a consistently revolutionary course only if it is firmly connected in one organisation with co-thinkers throughout the world and maintains a constant political and theoretical collaboration with them. All purely national groupings, all those who reject such international organisation, control and discipline are in their essence reactionary," end quote. In the final analysis, centrist politics represented a secondary agent of imperialism, functioning to block the path of the Revolutionary Party to the working class. The centrist tendencies undermined the struggle against Stalinism under conditions in which the Third International was being discredited in the eyes of workers. By 1935, in response to the victory of the Nazis and the threat it posed to the bureaucracy, the Stalinists would again make a sharp turn. Having previously refused Trotsky's call for a united front against the fascist threat, they now instigated a new program called the Popular Front. Not to be confused with the United Front policy of the left opposition, Popular Frontism meant the open rejection of proletarian revolution by the communist parties. In its place, they engaged in cross-class collaboration, forming alliances with various liberal, republican, and social democratic parties under the guise of fighting fascism, but subordinating any conception of world socialist revolution to the defence of their own nation state. The model of the Popular Front parties of the 1930s began in France. Just as the other European countries, France was rocked by a massive social convulsions in the early 1930s. In February 1934, a little over a year after Hitler came to power, a mobilisation of thousands of fascists and royalists brought down the thoroughly decayed Radical Party and installed a new Prime Minister, Gaston Doumergue. The semi-dictatorial measures of this government caused mass resistance in the working class. The Stalinists responded to this resistance by forming an alliance with the Social Democrats and the bourgeois Radical Party in the form of a Popular Front. Within the working class, they suppressed any demands which cut across the interests of their new bourgeois allies. They strangled the 1936 French general strike, paving the way for the capitulation of the Vichy regime to Hitler in 1940. However, nowhere would popular frontism prove to be more fatal than in Spain. During a time of mass revolutionary convulsions, the Stalinist turn to popular frontism offered a lifeline to the Spanish ruling elite. The Spanish Popular Front, which formed in January 1936, consisted of various Stalinist, anarchist, bourgeois and petty bourgeois forces. Above all, their orientation was the defence of capitalist property relations and the suppression of the class struggle. Here we also see the role of centrist forces. The Spanish POUM, P-O-U-M, was a left centrist party with significant sway within the working class and peasantry. Above all, this was due to the presence of André Nin, who was known internationally as a revolutionary. Nin was in regular contact with Trotsky, who patiently wrote polemics against his centrist orientation. However, Nin did not break with these politics, which meant the entry of the POUM into the Popular Front gave it a significant left-wing credentials. Then in 1936, the Popular Front was elected in Spain. Their coming to power opened up a renewed revolutionary upsurge of the working class, with workers taking control of factories and cities across the country. The Stalinists were deeply fearful of the revolution in Spain. Its success would break through the isolation of the working class in Russia, creating the conditions for a revival of the revolution. Moreover, it would create the conditions for workers' revolutions throughout Europe. So they fought relentlessly to prevent this. Through the Popular Front government, they refused to arm the workers. The Spanish military, which had been allowed to remain armed after the election, were then able to launch a civil war against the working class under the fascist general Francisco Franco. Now, the Stalinists offered every aid to Franco, including militarily intervening to smash up workers' resistance. The Stalinist secret police rounded up thousands of revolutionaries, tried, tortured, and executed their leaders, including Nin, and sent some 20,000 workers to labour camps to face brutality and death. The physical liquidation of a generation of revolutionaries in Spain had its counterpart in the Stalinist terror unleashed in Russia. Through a series of show trials called the Moscow Trials, Stalin and his henchmen looked to physically liquidate the entire generation of revolutionaries who were tempered in the experiences of the Russian Revolution, targeting not just the left opposition, but all the old Bolsheviks, that is, those who joined the Bolshevik Party prior to the October Revolution, and anyone remotely associated with them. They were now all seen as a threat. They were imprisoned, tortured, forced to sign fabricated confessions, and then executed. The complete numbers of those who died during the Stalinist terror are unknown, but estimates are as high as 1.2 million. Trotsky understood that to explain how the Third International, the party founded by Lenin, transformed so nakedly into an agency of imperialism, he had to disclose the objective economic roots of this betrayal, just as Lenin had done with the Second International. The culmination of this work is his book, The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1937. The Revolution Betrayed must be considered with Marx's Capital and Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, as one of the greatest achievements in revolutionary literature. Trotsky, applying the dialectical method, proved scientifically that the Third International had transformed into an agent of imperialism within the workers' movement, and that a new international had to be founded. The Stalinist bureaucracy, Trotsky insisted, did not constitute a new class in society, but acted as a caste that existed like a cancer on the workers' state. The Soviet Union was in a state of transition, a contradictory society in between capitalism and socialism. Trotsky characterized this state as a degenerating workers' state that could not be maintained in perpetuity. The regeneration of the USSR could only be achieved through a political revolution of the working class against the Kremlin. This movement of workers relied upon the development of the international revolution. The only other possibility was that the Stalinist bureaucracy would liquidate the gains of the October Revolution and restore capitalism within the USSR. The revolution portrayed would form the theoretical, political, and historical foundations of the founding program of the Fourth International. In going through these historical events, I have sought to give the founding of the Fourth International a renewed and wholly significant context. The series of defeats suffered by the working class over the 5-year period in the lead up to its founding reveal the absolute necessity of a vanguard revolutionary party. By 1938, the imminent threat of the Second World War made all the more urgent the founding of the new international. Had the party not been founded until after the 1939 outbreak of war, the Trotskyist movement would have been left without the necessary programmatical clarity, allowing it to withstand the immense pressures war placed on the workers' movement. The transitional program defined the attitude of the party to the outbreak of war, demarcating the attitude of the party to the various bourgeois justifications for war, rejecting all the abhorrent conceptions of race, blood, honour, and the defence of the fatherland. Crucial to this perspective was the Fourth International's defence of the USSR from imperialist invasion. Notwithstanding the bureaucratic caste that exists on top of the workers' state, the property relations established through the October Revolution needed to be defended. This perspective opposed all those who claimed that Moscow pursued imperialist policies and was no different to fascism. The Stalin-Hitler Pact of August 1939 became the occasion for layers of the middle class and intelligentsia to abandon their fight for the defence of the USSR. In the previous period, possible in these circles to continue to defend the Soviet Union, even while they were strangling the revolutionary movements across Europe through popular frontism. This was because it corresponded with the needs of imperialism. However, the Stalin-Hitler Pact cut across the foreign policy interests of the Western capitalist nations. This had an immediate impact on the newly founded Fourth International. In August-September 1939, 3 leading figures of the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, the US section of the Fourth International, formed a minority group in opposition to the party's definition of the Soviet Union as a degenerating workers' state. James Burnham and Max Shachtman led this group and argued the Stalinist bureaucracy represented a new class in society, one not anticipated by Marx, declaring the regime to be state capitalist or bureaucratic collectivist. What Trotsky was able to uncover in Burnham and Shachtman's formulation was a repudiation not just of the Fourth International, but the entire perspective of socialist revolution. If, as they claimed, the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia created a new form of class rule, it would follow that the working class is no longer the revolutionary force able to bring about a socialist transformation of society. The logical conclusion of such a theory is the abandonment of Marxism, the liquidation of the party, and desertion of the possibility of all social progress. The political struggle waged by Trotsky in the SWP is one of the richest and most important in the party's history. The incredible book, In Defense of Marxism, contains the numerous correspondence between Trotsky and the SWP and is essential reading for any developing revolutionary. The fight in the SWP anticipated the renunciations of Marxism by every revisionist tendency that emerged in the Fourth International over the next half-century. After Trotsky's assassination at the hands of the GPU in 1940, his writings formed the foundations of the political struggle waged in the Fourth International against opportunism and revisionism in the ensuing years. James P. Cannon, National Secretary of the SWP, would open up a 32-year struggle in the party against opportunism with the issuing of the open letter in 1953. This letter summed up all the essential political questions in the struggle against a new form of liquidationism, Pabloism, which will be dealt with in next week's lecture. The indelible lesson of the founding of the Fourth International is the role of the party as the instrument of world socialist revolution. We are now in a period in which great events are unfolding on an international scale. Every day, capitalism is revealing its bankruptcy to the working class. And what has occurred to all the organisations and tendencies that oppose the founding of this party? They have all turned to the camp of imperialism, abandoning Marxism and the working class. Indeed, the political trajectory of Burnham, after his resignation from the party, was sharply to the extreme right, eventually becoming a strategist for US imperialism. For the world, the question of the epoch remains the same today as it did 82 years ago. To overcome the crisis of revolutionary leadership, the vanguard party of the working class must be built. This is the great responsibility of everybody listening here tonight. I would like to leave you with the words of Trotsky in his opening address to the founding of the Fourth International, which has lost none of its relevance today. Quote, "The great events which rush upon mankind will not leave of these outlived organisations one stone upon another. Only the Fourth International looks with confidence at the future. It is the world party of socialist revolution. There never was a greater task on the earth. Upon every one of us rests a tremendous historical responsibility."
Thanks very much, Max, for that. Very wide-ranging lecture. We're very pleased to welcome Nick Beams. How are you, Nick?
Hello. Good evening, everyone.
We have participants who've indicated in the chat box where they're joining from, a wide range of centres across Australia, including Sydney, Adelaide, Gold Coast, Newcastle, Brisbane, Kingaroy in Queensland, the Blue Mountains and Lake Macquarie in New South Wales, Melbourne, and a participant from Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. Welcome, everybody. And we're especially pleased to have a contingent of international participants. A couple of comrades from Miami in Florida in the United States and Brooklyn in New York. Very early morning there, so welcome. We have participants from Sri Lanka, Germany, and we're very proud to have received greetings of solidarity from the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and from supporters, from members of the International Committee of the Fourth International Supporters Group in India. So welcome, everybody. Again, the chat box is there for you to record your questions, impressions on the lecture. It was a very far-reaching presentation. It covered the Nazi takeover in Germany in 1933, Trotsky's struggle against centrism in the 1930s, the Spanish Revolution, the question of Stalinism and the liquidation of the left opposition within the Soviet Union, as well as the related issues covered in the Revolution Betrayed work of Leon Trotsky. It then went on to detail the question of the transitional program and the basis upon which the Fourth International was established, as well as detailing aspects of Burnham-Shachtman tendency within the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States and its repudiation of Marxism. These are all very complex historical and political issues. So we welcome any question whatsoever, any request for an elaboration, use that chat box. The initial questions that we've received touch on the contemporary situation. And I think that's very fitting given that Trotsky's fight for the Fourth International is a relentlessly contemporary question. So we have a couple of comments and questions. Rebecca writes the following: what strikes me about how the Nazis came to power was the similarity of confusion between left-wing ideals and far right-wing actions among the working class of the USA and Brazil, etc. today. Neil responded that he sees the point. What would happen if right now an external trigger event brought the USA to war with an external target? Would fascism become pervasive in the USA? Neil then added, it seems to be paramount that groups like the SEP take a leadership role, as if there is no other option, where are the people to turn? Those are important issues. I might just ask Max and Nick to reflect on those while I make a couple of literature announcements. On offer from Mering Books this is a very special sale offer. You'll see on the slide there, we're offering you an opportunity to purchase this as a bundle if you purchase the Transitional Program and the Revolution Betrayed, both key works by Leon Trotsky, as was detailed in Max's lecture. You will see that that's a 15% discount. This is very affordable, very cheap, on offer now. $6.80 for the Death Agony of Capitalism, Task of the Fourth International, the Transitional Program, and less than $30 for the Revolution Betrayed. Leon Trotsky is, of course, the key strategist of world socialist revolution. No one can hope to put forward a revolutionary perspective within the international working class today without assimilating the central works of Leon Trotsky. And these two are among the most important, the most relevant, the most critical today. So I'd encourage everybody who doesn't own those two works to order those now. You can send us an email to Mering Books. That's the best way to organise the delivery. You'll see the address down the bottom there, mering@aussiemail.com.au, mering@aussiemail.com.au. Even if you can't immediately pay the money, if you send us an email, you'll have those works reserved at that discounted price. So I'd encourage you, even while the meeting's on, shoot us a quick email, let us know that you're interested and we can contact you. The next offer is The Heritage We Defend. This is $34.95. This book is a very powerful summation of the history of the entire history of the Fourth International, from its establishment, as was detailed in the lecture tonight, through to the different fights that were different struggles over the defense of Trotskyism against revisionism and against opportunism as it emerged in the decades after the founding of the Fourth International. The author there is David North. As you can see, he's the chairman of the World Socialist website International Editorial Board, also the chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. And this is a special 30th anniversary edition that's got a new preface, a new glossary as well, which is very helpful. And we encourage everybody here to purchase this key work. Again, it is essential reading for revolutionists in this coming period. One can't hope to put forward a perspective within the current juncture without an understanding of the struggles that were waged previously. So it is essential reading for every socialist. So again, if you don't already own that one, shoot us an email, mering@aussiemail.com.au, and order that one there. Finally, I'd just like to let participants know about, again, this is another special offer just for participants in this lecture tonight. You can get 15% off this bundle from Vadim Z. Rogovin. The first one there on the right is 1937, Stalin's Year of Terror. And the one on the left, you can see Bolsheviks Against Stalinism, 1928 to 1933, Leon Trotsky and the Left Opposition. These are both essential works published by Mering Books. The author, Vadim Rogovin, just to give some detail about who he is, he was a Soviet and then Russian sociologist, the author of more than 250 scholarly papers in the Soviet Union. When he was in his 20s, during the Khrushchev era, he began attempting to study the history of the Russian Revolution, the history of Stalinism, and despite the immense Stalinist censorship and exclusion of any access to the works of Leon Trotsky, Rogovin concluded that, in fact, Trotsky and the left opposition had been right, Stalin had been a criminal, and on that basis then developed a whole series of works detailing the question of social inequality in the Soviet Union. After the liquidation of the USSR in 1991, Vadim came in contact with the International Committee of the Fourth International, established a very close working relationship with David North, and on that basis then developed a multi-volume history of the struggles of Leon Trotsky and the left opposition, and those two key works detail those. David North once described Vadim as a prophet of historical truth, which is very apposite. Vadim was a passionate fighter for historical truth, for the socialist movement, for establishing the record of what actually happened in the Soviet Union, that there was an alternative to Stalinism, that Stalin did not represent the continuity of Marxism, the continuity of Leninism, but in actual fact, it's counter-revolutionary antipode. And so his works, again, are crucial for assimilating the historical lessons of the Russian Revolution, its betrayal, and the struggle that was waged to oppose that betrayal by Trotsky and the left opposition. We encourage all of you to purchase these works as a means of developing yourselves as Marxists, as Trotskyists, as revolutionists. The great revolutionist Rosa Luxemburg once said that socialism is not a bread and butter problem, but a cultural movement, a great and proud world ideology. And assimilating this movement does take some work. It takes study, it takes reading, but this is not an individual question. The party is available to facilitate your education, your learning as Marxists, as socialists. And so the starting point is to purchase your own Marxist library and begin to work through that. So we'd encourage you to, again, email into Merring Books. You can ask for our catalogue as well for other works of history and politics. You can see what's on offer there. We obviously encourage all of you to consider joining our movement. If you agree with our perspective, agree with this historical analysis, you should make the decision to join our party. But I'd like to now pass it to our panelists, Max and Nick. We do have other questions coming in, which I'll get to, but if we can begin with those initial questions that I read out earlier.
Well, I think in dealing with the question of, I think there was a number of questions around the rise of, potential rise of fascism today. I think Neil put, if there was an external trigger event, would fascism be pervasive in the United States? I mean, one of the differences between the rise of the far right and fascistic forces today and that of the 1930s was that Nazism was a mass movement. It did have behind it large sections of the lumpen proletariat and the wrecked layers of the middle class. Today, though, the fascist movements and the far right movements are very small in comparison. They don't hold mass sway amongst whole sections. And in fact, what is going on now is a conspiracy by the bourgeoisie to promote these forces in countries around the world. Above all, this is because there's been a massive lurch to the right by all the political parties internationally, including layers of the intelligentsia and upper middle class who seek to justify the return of the far right internationally. And we have followed these events very closely. We've published a book, Why Are They Back, by Comrade Christoph, which details the rise or the return in that sense of the far right in Germany, above all detailing our, our fight, our struggle against Johann Bobrowski at Humboldt University, who was, quite now famous in saying, I'd say, or infamous in saying that Hitler wasn't a bad man. He didn't like the discussion of the Holocaust at his dinner table. Now, other than being factually incorrect, because Hitler did participate in that, what was behind this was now a wholly new justification for the return to the extreme right-wing, fascism internationally, and in particular in Germany. The German bourgeoisie needed to remilitarize. Now, in the United States, there's obviously a similar process underway, particularly around Trump, who's been going around with his, always making appeals to the far right. In fact, really cultivated, particularly in the police force and appealing to the army, are these forces. However, I think, again, the big difference is that at the moment, they aren't mass movements. I think the outbreak of war, far from creating the conditions in which all of a sudden fascism will be completely pervasive, I think, the general movement of the working class internationally is towards the left, not towards the right. We see that now. In the United States, you have the largest multiracial, multi-ethnic protests in the history of the country. It's breaking apart all the kind of racialist narratives that are being promoted. But another key feature, and I think this is also a very important part of it, is the role of the so-called left, the pseudo-left parties, as we call them internationally, who promote very much racialist and identity politics lines, which themselves lend more closely to the kind of fascist and far-right lines, you know, of those type of forces, including the question of, and this happens very much on college campus in the United States, segregation, special places for just black people where white people can't go in, etc. And that is a universal process. It's happening here and has happened here in Australia, in universities as well. But I think the fundamental difference is that it isn't a mass movement, but that doesn't mean we're not ruthless in exposing, you know, the kind of conspiracy to produce to push the right wing or to push the agenda of the right wing and the fascist forces. But I think, as Trotsky drew out in With a France, I mean, above all, what is required is a revolutionary party that has a clear and concise program, and they're confident in their perspective that they push, and that will win the masses, towards the program of revolution. And that's the answer. Anyway, I'll start with those points.
Just to add to what Max has raised, I mean, there was, as Cheryl explained in her lecture last week, and Max reiterated again today, there was nothing inevitable about the coming to power of Hitler in Germany. It was, above all, a product of the criminal policies pursued by the Communist International and the KPD, the Communist Party in Germany. The policy of designating the Social Democrats as social fascists, that is, workers who joined the social democracy as equivalent to the fascists, split the working class and enabled Hitler to come to power. Now, of course, social democracy is a bourgeois party. It defends the capitalist order. There was no disagreement with the Stalinists on that question. The issue was, though, the following. They rested on different social foundations. The fascists rested upon elements of the deranged and stricken middle classes, sections of the lumpen proletariat, and were an open agency of the bourgeoisie. Social democracy rested upon, as did the Communist Party of Germany, organizations of the working class. So the aim of fascism was, of course, to smash those organizations. And Trotsky explained in the policy of the United Front that it was necessary to unify in a common struggle, not on political questions, but on the question of the defense of the organizations of the working class, to unite all workers' organizations to defeat the fascist menace. And this would open up, through its development, the struggle for socialism. Now, we don't have, of course, a repeat. History doesn't repeat itself, and we don't have a repeat in the United States today and in other countries where we see this drive to authoritarian forms of rule, Germany and other countries. We see the same processes internationally. But we do face the same crucial questions, in that fascism and right-wing and authoritarian forms of rule, you could say, are the punishment for the inflicted upon the working class for the failure to undertake the necessary revolutionary struggle. And the chief agencies in that are not the right-wing ideologues. They're not the ones who cause the confusion. Those who cause the confusion, above all, as Max has outlined, are the pseudo-lefts, who say that when a policeman kills a black worker, as we've seen, then he's acting in the interests of whiteness, which we all have within us, and the racial prejudices that exist in all white people. He's acting on that behalf, and thereby obscuring the fundamental question that the police act as an arm of the capitalist state to defend class rule, capitalist property relations, and that it's a turn to the working class that must be undertaken to overthrow this state. That's the crucial issue. And that's the crucial task facing the working class in the United States and elsewhere. And so the fight for the clarification of the working class as to its historic tasks takes place above all through the struggle against these forms of identity politics which seek to obscure the fundamental class issues and political issues facing the working class.
Thank you, Nick and Max. Just a reminder, when participants are typing questions and responses into the chat box, just check that you're sending it to the whole group. You do that by clicking on that blue button and just checking that you're sending your message to all panelists and attendees. We have a question that, Nick, your remarks just then touched on, but perhaps we can elaborate it. Kerry asks, could you expand on the position taken by Stalin designating the Social Democrats as social fascists? Did he give an outline to his position? Why is this position described as ultra-left? Do the Social Democrats have a contemporary equivalent? Thank you.
Well, I could perhaps you take that up if you want it. Mm-hmm. The issue was that Stalin, Trotsky once put it this way, he said that the Stalinist bureaucracy attempted to deliver a bureaucratic ultimatum to the working class instead of the actual active fight against fascism. The issue was to mobilise all sections of the working class, whatever organisations and trade unions they happen to be in, to fight the fascist. Stalinism delivered a bureaucratic ultimatum and said, we'll fight the fascists alongside of you, provided you break from your parties and your organisations, completely jumping over the necessity of the Communist Party, the revolutionary leadership, to develop policies which could convince workers in the course of their practice and their struggle, the bankruptcy of their social democratic leaders. Trotsky put it very simply. He said, look, the United Front policy is this. If the fascists threaten a meeting of the trade union or a social democratic party meeting, then the Communist Party will mobilise all its forces to defend that meeting. At the same time, it continues its unrelenting criticism of the policies of the social democratic leaders, explaining that in fact their policies are responsible for the rise and the growth of the fascists. But we will come to the assistance and the defence of all the organisations of the working class, because ultimately our party rests upon those organisations as well, all the previous historic gains of the workers' movement. And Trotsky insisted it was not just a question of fascists coming to power and eliminating a few leaders, but completely erasing all the gains of the working class that have been won in the previous decades of struggle. That was the essence of the difference. And the policy of Stalinism was, after Hitler, our turn, that somehow fascism would produce a radicalisation of the masses which would lead to onto socialism, without the fundamental task of breaking the working class from its old organisations, winning them to the ranks of the Revolutionary Party. An attempt, as Trotsky said once, to rape the historical process by a series of bureaucratic ultimatums. And that led to an historic defeat.
Thanks, Nick. Max, did you want to add to that?
I think Nick covered it quite well. I mean, you know, the demarcation was to say essentially that the Social Democrats or social democracy was no different to, you know, fascist Hitler. I mean, that, you know, what a confusing position to put to the working class. One of the points I will, you know, just to emphasise what Nick said, is that while the Second International had carried out a great betrayal in 1914, by even in 1933, they still had a mass of workers who were in the party, and it was still a workers' organisation. So those workers needed to be won to the perspective. You know, you needed that united front. Anyway, I think that the points Nick raised are important.
Mm. I mean, I'll just add to that. I mean, just to reiterate the point that was raised in the lecture, I believe. I mean, Trotsky's writings on Nazism are amongst his most important, his most prescient, penetrating, and they are really crucial reading. Again, via Merriam Books. I mean, in one article of Leon Trotsky's, he wrote, "The key to the international situation." He made the following point, quote, "It is necessary without any delay finally to elaborate a practical system of measures, not with the aim of merely exposing social democracy, before the communists, but with the aim of actual struggle against fascism. Every factory must become an anti-fascist bulwark with its own commandants and its own battalions. It is necessary to have a map of the fascist barracks and all other fascist strongholds in every city and in every district. The fascists are attempting to encircle the revolutionary strongholds. The encirclers must be encircled. On this basis, an agreement with the social democratic and trade union organisations is not only permissible, but a duty. And then he goes on, just one final quote. The program of action must be strictly practical, strictly objective, to the point, without any of those artificial claims, without any reservations, so that every average social democratic worker can say to himself, what the communists propose is completely indispensable for the struggle against fascism. On this basis, we must pull the social democratic workers along with us by our example and criticise their leaders, who will inevitably serve as a check and a brake. Only in this way is victory possible, end quote. So Trotsky was very sensitive to how the revolutionists in Germany were going to win the majority of the working class, because the Social Democratic Party in Germany still maintained the support, active support of broad layers of workers in Germany. And so the question of how to break workers from their social democratic illusions was a very important aspect of Trotsky's exposure of Stalin's sectarian rhetoric about the social fascists and so on. I think the final part of the question that we read out from Kerry about the contemporary equivalent, I mean, the most obvious and immediate difference between social democracy today and social democracy in the 1930s is that today it has no mass base. These are not workers' organisations. I mean, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, as I said, had a mass base within the German working class. Today, what's the situation? Look at the Labor Party here in Australia. I mean, if anybody saw 60 Minutes on Sunday, you get a real glimpse into the real nature of the Labor Party. This is not a workers' organisation. There are no workers in their millions actively supporting and fighting for this program. This is a party of apparatchiks, careerists, bureaucrats, social climbers, out-and-out bourgeois elements. And so the situation today is very different than it was in Germany in the 1930s. I think we'll take the next question, which flows on quite well chronologically, I think, which is, the question is from Steph. What is the Popular Front? Is this multiple parties?
Well, I think to flow on from, I think Nick made some really clear points on the difference, on what the United Front was. I mean, the Popular Front is almost the antithesis. It's opposite. It's complete cross-class collaboration. And it did involve more than one party, but in many ways it was instigated and pushed forward as a program of the Comintern by the Stalinists. So that is that you enter into a political group that includes bourgeois parties, as I said, the Radical Party in France, various anarchist movements, etc. I mean, on a fundamental level, though, all the popular fronts that were created agreed in the suppression of the class struggle of the working class, and it defended private property relations. And so these, various parties in countries throughout Europe were then the lifeline that the ruling elite in those countries, such as France and Spain, which we went through in the lecture, needed in order to strangle the revolutionary movement of the working class. Now, it was on two fronts by the Stalinists. On the one hand, they desperately wanted to strangle the revolutionary movement of the masses across Europe, because they were fearful that, and correctly so, that a revolutionary movement of the working class in, say, Spain or France would cut across the isolation of Russia and renew the revolutionary, masses in that country. The other point was that it was a response to the victory of Hitler in Germany. The Stalinists were looking to form alliances with the various, bourgeois capitalist governments in Europe and including the United States, actually, in order to defend them from an invasion from, Nazi Germany. And that's why I think I tried to detail at the end there. There was a difference in the period that we went through in the late 1930s between the kind of liberalism in the United States, where it could defend the USSR because its interests lined up with that of US and European imperialism, that is, suppressing the class struggle and supporting the bourgeoisie. But then once the Stalin-Hitler Pact occurred later on in 1939, there was a difference. But anyway, I think just with those opening remarks, I think that's to go to a bit of what Popular Front is in this.
The question of Popular Front politics has a very, very direct relevance to the situation today, particularly in the United States, where the argument is put forward, look, Trump is moving to impose an authoritarian regime. On June the 1st, he actually made an attempt at a coup d'etat to use the military extra-constitutionally. He is promoting right-wing and fascistic forces, which he is. So therefore it is argued, well, shouldn't we come together, with the Democrats? Shouldn't the left, Socialist Equality Party, line up behind the Democrats? We have to do everything to prevent the continuation of the Trump administration. And that is a noose being prepared around the neck of the working class, because the Democrats don't have any fundamental difference with Trump. There are tactical differences over the question of US foreign policy, Russia, China, etc. But the Democrats represent, as embodied in Hillary Clinton and as embodied in Joseph Biden, Wall Street, the military intelligence apparatus, and so on. And in fact, they're basing themselves very directly upon the military. Joseph Biden, in a very revealing interview, raised the question that Trump may not accept an election defeat in November. And Biden said, well, the military will prevent him from doing that. In other words, the military, in the eyes of the Democrats and in the politics of the Democrats, is the arbiter of politics in the United States. So you may not get exactly the same kind of authoritarian regime as you would under Trump. You'll get another variant of it. And that's the great danger. All of these forces are opposed to the independent development of the struggle of the working class. And we have to draw some sharp lessons. In the year 2000, the election was stolen by the Supreme Court and given to George W. Bush. When Al Gore had won it, they repudiated the counting of votes in Florida. Al Gore accepted that decision on the basis that mobilizing his supporters and the millions who voted for him against this theft of the election would provoke too much of a class struggle in the United States, which the Democrats oppose. And it's the same question now. They don't say, we will turn to if Trump refuses to go, we will turn to our supporters, we will drive him out of office. No, because that would bring forward what they fear most of all, a movement of the working class from below. So the defeat of Trump and the interest that he represents cannot be carried forward on any kind of cross-class collaboration with the Democrats and the military apparatus and Wall Street that they represent. That's the lesson of Spain. We don't have to repeat these great defeats, and we must not. The lesson of Spain is precisely that. How did Franco come to power? From Morocco, when the Republican government and the working class held power in all the major cities in Spain. How was it possible for Franco to win a civil war in 3 years? Because the working class was subordinated to the bourgeois parties, and that prepared the way for the victory of Franco. So quite literally, the lessons of Popular Front politics have been paid for in blood by the working class, and they cannot be repeated in the present situation that we now face.
Thank you, Nick. There are more questions coming in. I'm just going to raise the next one and then make a brief announcement. There is another question, again, on these historical issues, the question of the United Front and Popular Front, which is important. We have someone requesting that we elaborate on the coming to power of the Nazis in 1933 and the response of the Third International. While our panelists are considering that one, I'd just like to briefly make an appeal to the Socialist Equality Party's monthly fund. The party raises every month the necessary financing for our movement from within the working class. We require the sacrifice, the generosity, the solidarity of working class people, students, young people, others supporting the party to raise the necessary finances to support our practical work within the working class. to support the work of our movement through the World Socialist website. We collaborate internationally on a daily basis in sustaining what is now the world's most widely accessed socialist publication on the planet. We've received a very substantial increase in daily hits on the WSWS amidst the accelerating crisis of the world capitalist system. I know many of you participating tonight already donate to our monthly fund, but if you can contribute extra, we very much encourage that. Obviously, the coronavirus restrictions have affected our ability to conduct certain elements of face-to-face work within the working class. So we rely on these online meetings in part to help us sustain that financing. So thank you for those people who've indicated already. Please keep them coming as the meeting rolls on. We'll take that question now on the Third International, that is the Stalinist reaction to Hitler's seizure of power. Nick, do you want to speak on that?
Well, just briefly, I mean, the coming to power of Hitler was an enormous crisis for the, it came out of an enormous crisis for the German bourgeoisie. There were two elections in 1932, and in fact, the peak of Hitler's power, which was about 30-odd% of the electorate, under 40%, came in July of 1932. The parliament had no stable majority, and a new election was called in November of 1932. And the Nazi vote actually declined by 2 million. And this was recognized as a crisis in the German ruling class, that there were signs of revival of the workers' movement, and they greatly feared that having backed Hitler and sought to use him against the working class, the opportunity would be missed. And so from November, December, right through to January, there was a conspiracy organized within the leading circles of the German ruling elites to bring Hitler to power, and eventually Hindenburg was organized to do that on January the 30th. He was installed. Immediately followed came the Reichstag fire, the provocation launched by the Nazis, the Enabling Act passed in March of, I think March the 5th, 1933, which established rule by decree. Now this possibility had been prepared by the policies of the KPD, as we outlined, and the Comintern. Now, what took place following that, as Trotsky wrote immediately afterwards, the KPD was finished as a party of revolution. But he waited. Was there going to be any reaction in the Communist International? Was there going to be any criticism of the disaster that had taken place? The Communist International met, the organization of the Stalinist parties around the world. Not a single voice of criticism was raised of the policies that had led to the greatest defeat of the working class in history. And it was on that basis that Trotsky explained from the test of events themselves that this party was finished for the purposes of revolution, and the new international had to be built. And there are, of course, parallels with Lenin's struggle to found the Third International. It was established in 1919, but Lenin put forward the perspective of a new international, not in 1919 on the basis of the success of the Russian Revolution, but in 1915, when following the betrayal of the Second International, when it voted for war credits, voted to support its own ruling classes in World War I. Lenin drew the conclusion, and he was, talk about minorities. At the Zimmerwald conference, Lenin was the left faction was a minority of that conference, the Zimmerwald conference of 1915, called to oppose the war by socialist-minded organizations. Lenin was in a minority at that Congress. He fought intransigently for the Third International. So those who say, well, a new international can only be established on the basis of a great upheaval of the working class, completely misread history. Lenin established the need for a new international following that great betrayal. And it was on the basis of that struggle that the future victory, Lenin could not predict it in 1915, but it was only on the basis of that intransigent struggle for a new international leadership that the Russian Revolution was successful and was able to be carried out. So I think there are very important lessons here for us today.
Thanks, Nick. That was a pretty comprehensive review. Max, did you want to add anything to that, or should we take the next question?
Look, the only thing the SPD in Germany, through the course of the lead up to 1933, had displayed and what would you say, destroyed its democratic facade, by supporting the German government when it ruled through the emergency decrees, as I went through briefly in the lecture. Yet the SPD, as we've gone through, still had millions of workers behind them. So you had a situation where the German Communist Party, it was in that sense up to them to win the vast sections of workers from the SPD who were being told and demonstrated every day the bankruptcy of its leadership. Yet the policy of essentially saying that they're twins, that, the SPD and the Nazis were twins, even in one point, I think it was in 1931, Nick can correct me if I'm wrong, 1931, I think the Communist Party voted in favour of the Nazis of overthrowing an SPD, or a referendum to overthrow SPD government in Prussia. You had the situation where, it just completely split the working class to pieces. And what had happened in the German Communist Party is the fight against the left opposition, the fight against Trotskyism by the Stalinist bureaucracy had transformed the KPD into, just a complete agent of Stalinism. And so, I think Nick went through it. I think it's important. Trotsky didn't immediately call for a new international, but he did say that, at that stage, the German Communist Party was certainly dead. But then he would wait to see what happened with the others, and that's where he witnessed that they all voted in favour of the new after Hitler us. Anyway. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Max. That was important. We do want to get to as many questions as possible tonight before we conclude. The next one is directed specifically to Nick. With the Fed having printed $3 trillion in the last 2 months and a decision made of unlimited quantitative easing as a bottomless backstop for Wall Street, why is the pressure one of deflation and not inflation? Is it because the trillions have stayed with the top 1%? If labour power is the true form of value, where and how is this reckoning with money printing to be reconciled? The GFC reaction kicks the can down the road, and here it surely stops. Thanks, Peter.
Well, I'll try and be brief because we want to get through some questions. But essentially, what has been created is a vast mountain of fictitious capital. A share doesn't embody value. A financial asset doesn't embody value. It's a claim on value. And that value is only obtained through the exploitation of the labour power of the working class. Let's look what happened in middle of March. The financial markets around the world froze completely. You couldn't sell even government bonds, even treasury bonds. You could not sell. That is, they were worthless. They had no value, no intrinsic value. The Fed came in, pumped in trillions of dollars and reinflated the market. But the same issue still remains. Value can only be pumped back into these assets, these claims on value, if it's extracted from the working class. And we therefore see the objective driving force behind the policies, not just of the Trump administration, but of every government around the world, to pursue this homicidal return to work policy. No matter what the danger to workers' lives, they must get back to work and start producing surplus value and profit to pump up the value of the assets that we hold. What does this mean? It means that a massive class confrontation is building up, is developing, and is going to explode on an international scale in which the working class will be directly confronted with the task of taking political power. The crucial question is, and what we're discussing here today and tonight, is whether there exists a revolutionary party capable of leading that struggle to the conquest of political power. That party has to be prepared in advance, now, not in the midst and the heat of the battle, but now, as it develops, and the cadres, workers in every section of industry, in the universities, among the youth, prepared, which can explain to their fellow workers, their fellow students, their fellow youth, the necessity for a socialist struggle to overthrow the capitalist system. That's the crucial factor in this historic process, the Revolutionary Party, and that's why our lecture has focused on the founding of the Fourth International tonight.
Thanks, Nick. There's another question touching on a particularly important aspect of Max's lecture that we haven't delved into, which I think is important. It's from Rodney, who asks, well, initially raises, the most dangerous development of centrism in the POUM in Spain and the SWP in the USA was closely examined by Trotsky in the 1930s. Would anyone like to comment about centrism?
I think centrism, as I tried to explain through the lecture, is an attempt to find some kind of middle road between that of social democracy, that is, those of the Second International on the one hand, whose policy of reformism through Parliament has been rendered completely useless in that period, in the 1920s and early 1930s. And then on the other hand, the Stalinists and the Comintern, which suppressed the class struggle. And they gained, quite a deal of adherence from different, from conscious workers because of the fact that because people were seeking out an alternative. However, the groupings that emerged, were typically vague and ill-defined themselves, typically not producing, in the same form, a concrete, clear program as we went through, which is an absolute necessity in any party, a particularly revolutionary party, as we've gone through, I think, in the question of the founding of our party. And so these centrist organisations, existed in this way, but they were, with the developments that we've gone through, there were left centrists that were emerging. I think Andre Nin that we went through in Spain was a clear indication of these layers. He was quite a courageous revolutionary in different ways, but he would not break from his centrist politics. And what was their opposition? And as I tried to explain in the lecture, what was their opposition to joining the Fourth International? Is that they wanted autonomy to work as they needed to in the national sphere, to make whatever collaborations and relationships they wanted. They did not want to be subordinate to the question of the world socialist revolution, that is the international. So that was their primary opposition. And yes, it was an important fight, not just because, it was a fight to demarcate the Fourth International, but also Trotsky's polemics were designed to win the best elements to the Fourth International, to build it, at that period of time. Anyway, I'll just start with those comments.
Trotsky continually raised with Nin the necessity to join the Fourth International, build the Fourth International. And he did not do that. And the eventual, as Max explained, Nin was a revolutionist. He'd been at the founding, he'd been at the first congresses of the Communist International. He was known, but it meant a break with various petty bourgeois organisations in Spain and striking out on an independent course. And that may leave you isolated for a period of time. It may. But the overriding question, and that exerts a certain pressure, but the overriding question is the correctness of a program and an analysis. And rejecting the Fourth International, we have to draw the lesson. Where did Nin end up? For all his credentials, for all his heroic struggles that he waged, where did he end up? He ended up supporting the Popular Front, particularly in Catalonia, in Barcelona, which strangled the revolution. And that's the important lesson to be drawn from centrism. The class struggle is relentless and remorseless. It doesn't tolerate halfway measures. And I think that's one of the important issues. And so we, as I said, in the United States, we have this attempt to sort of revive popular front politics. We must all get behind the Democrats, you know, whatever. I mean, they're not even comparable to the parties in Spain. I mean, 80 years on, we've had an enormous degeneration of bourgeois politics, but the same arguments are put forward, and they're deadly.
And just briefly to add to that, I mean, Trotsky's struggle against centrism was broadly denounced by these leaders, by these organizations, as being sectarian, as being hair-splitting, as being off-putting and so on. The exact same rhetoric that was leveled by the Mensheviks against the Bolsheviks prior to the successful seizure of power in October 1917 by the working class led by the Bolshevik Party. The exact same rhetoric that's heard today, leveled by the pseudo-left organizations in Australia and internationally against our movement, that the struggle for principle, the struggle to demarcate from all forms of bourgeois ideology, bourgeois politics, is sectarianism. We reject that, and this is clearly the way forward to building and establishing, the political independence of the working class is to demarcate from all expressions of these bourgeois pressures and establish the independent political line that is required to overthrow the capitalist system and to institute a workers' government. You can donate to the Socialist Equality Party if you're an Australian national and Australian citizen, using that link that you can see there on the slides. If you're an international participant, please donate to the World Socialist website using that link that you can see there as well. Let's move to the next question. What about the theory of forming coalitions solely for the purpose of opposing fascism? I think there is value in those coalitions. For example, the SWP, that is the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK, engage in such work frequently so as to ensure the lessons of World War II are remembered. Yet those coalitions need to be sustained as coalitions and not be enabled as popular fronts because they can't become a united front. Some complex issues within that question. Which one of our panelists wants to kick us off? I'll just clarify, the SWP there in the United Kingdom is different from the SWP in the United States that was referred to in Max's lecture. The Socialist Workers' Party in the United States was established in the United States as a section of the Fourth International, that is of the Trotskyist movement. The SWP in Britain was a very different beast. It was led by a figure called Tony Cliff, who was initially a member of the Fourth International, but I believe either during or immediately prior to World War II, broke from the Fourth International, rejected Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union, declared that the Soviet Union was state capitalist, which expressed a very pessimistic outlook in the aftermath of World War II. And so the SWP in Britain emerged on that sort of state capitalist basis, the same political perspective that is defended here in Australia today by the Socialist Alternative Group. Nick, do you want to speak on some of the issues bound up with that question?
Yeah, well, the politics of all of these organisations consist in subordinating the working class to the existing political establishment. And the politics of the SWP, what did they do in Britain? Where did they stand, for example, on the question of Brexit? Far from developing an independent policy for the working class, they developed the policy of, the left Brexit, and lined up with, George Galloway was in it, and they lined up with the right wing. He openly, who they supported, openly lined up with the right wing in Britain. They hailed Corbyn as the leadership of the Labor Party, that this could be a transformative moment, that it could turn, the old trick of turning water into wine. The British Labor Party under Corbyn could become once again a could become a socialist party. We insisted that the British Labor Party is a party of British imperialism, and that this miraculous transformation could not take place. This ended in, disaster. collapse, the Corbynite perspective. The same issue applies in the United States. All of these organisations are claimed in one way or another to be socialist or anti-fascist or whatever. They orbit around the Democratic Party. They do not undertake an independent turn to the working class. They either orbit around the Labor Party, or in particular, they form rotten alliances with sections of the trade union bureaucracy, particularly in Britain. So this is not, anti-fascist united front, politics or whatever. They always try and draw the parallel with Germany, but there's no comparison at all. What it is to seek to distort the lessons of Germany and turn them towards the practice of opportunist politics today, centering around the existing organisations, and bureaucracies of the Labor Party and the trade unions, and oppose the independent mobilisation of the working class. We were the only party in Britain, for example, opposed to the politics of the SWP, which advanced an independent policy in the Brexit referendum, an active boycott and the fight for the United Socialist States of Europe. We said there was no side in this that you could support. You couldn't support remaining in the EU, the politics of European and British finance capital, nor could you support Brexit led by right-wing cabals in Britain, which are another form of British imperialism and British nationalism. The working class had to have an independent policy and program based upon the unification of the working class in Britain and Europe and the fight for a socialist program. That was opposed by all of these tendencies and organisations.
Thank you, Nick. Max, did you want to add to that?
Look, I think Nick's answer was quite comprehensive. I just want to perhaps point out, I quite like, there's a comment in the chat that talks about Assange is the litmus test, and it really is for all these political parties that Nick mentioned. I mean, above all, they have abandoned Assange on the basis of, identity politics initially with the kind of, the false rape allegations, and continue to abandon him in this period. And so I think if you want an example of how far these organisations have lurched to the right, just look at the question of Assange.
Good point. We are going to need to begin to wrap up our meeting, the lecture tonight. Apologies if, I think we got to most questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours. Please make sure you leave us your contact details. If there are any outstanding questions, we're more than willing to extend the discussion with different participants. Thank you very much, Max. Thank you very much, Nick, for your involvement tonight, answering your people's questions. I think it was very important and clarifying. I just reiterate by referring participants to Merring Books. You can shoot us an email on that email address that we notified you previously. We appreciate and very grateful for your financial support expressed tonight. And I would like to conclude by making an appeal for everybody here to give very serious consideration to joining the Socialist Equality Party. If you're in Australia, and joining the International Committee of the Fourth International if you are elsewhere. You can read the Socialist Equality Party Statement of Principles. That is a succinct summation of the political basis of our party. You can order that again through Merring Books. Our party is unlike any other party. We exist not to amass deputies in Parliament, not to amass financial and organisational resources. All these, of course, are necessary, as Trotsky explained, but we are seeking to overthrow the capitalist system and establish a new, rational social society that's geared towards not the accumulation of corporate profit and private wealth, but rather the satisfaction of basic social needs for the vast majority of the population, the working class. This requires a struggle. This requires you to come off the political sidelines, join our party, fight for it, build it in the working class. We are in an explosive political period. The World Socialist website at the beginning of this year issued a very important perspective titled "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." And within a matter of weeks and months, this perspective has been more than borne out. There are big historical shifts already underway at a very advanced stage, and the situation contains very real dangers. We've spoken about the dangers of fascism tonight, the question of capitalist breakdown, climate change. There are serious dangers confronting the international working class, but there is also, again, on the other side, a growing resurgence, a growing movement of the international working class, but this requires leadership, conscious leadership. There's not going to be a spontaneous resolution to this crisis, and that's the role of the party. So please give consideration to joining our party. If you'd like to learn more about us, our principles, statement of principles, our history, we're unlike any other party. Other parties seek to cover up their history, cover up their record of betrayals and manoeuvring. Unlike those parties, our political tendency has a clean banner and unfolds its history on the basis upon which people learn the lessons of the strategic experiences of the international working class in the 20th century and in the initial stages of the 21st century. And it's on that basis that we recruit and go forward. So again, we'll conclude the lecture tonight. Just finally, a reminder that this is a weekly lecture series. So the same time, same place, next Tuesday evening. The next lecture is on the International Committee of the Fourth International and the war against Pabloism. So that's continuing on some of the themes that were touched on in the final part of Max's lecture. The initial split in the Fourth International in 1953, the struggle that was waged by the International Committee of the Fourth International to defend genuine Trotskyism, orthodox Trotskyism in extraordinarily difficult political circumstances. But this again, as with the political issues that we touched on tonight and in previous lectures, the issues in the struggle against Pabloism are of essential contemporary political significance. So we look forward to having everybody back here next week, and please let people know, workmates, colleagues, fellow students, friends, family, we're seeking to build these lectures as broadly as we can. So please encourage people that you know to join us next week, and we'll see you then. But for now, we'll bid you good evening and conclude the meeting. Thanks again.